Welcome back to the channel. Today we're going to be looking at and walking through how we can deploy to CloudHub 2 using Maven tools. So we're going to look at this end-to-end as if we've just created a brand new application, look at all of the configuration and settings we need to make, and then lastly show the actual commands, Maven commands being run to do the deployment, and hopefully we should see it in our sandbox here running. So to start, I'm just going to create a new Mule application, and we can just call it ch2 deployment example. Okay, so we've got our brand new empty application. Now at this point, as a developer, I'll just be doing my normal implementation. So actually creating this API using the standard tools. As an example, we'll just create a very basic flow with a HTTP listener, and we can log, and we'll set a static message to respond with. So for the listener, we'll create a default configuration. The port we'll set to http.port. So this port we could leave as 8081 as that's what CloudHub 2 uses, but we can also use this http.port, which is similar to CloudHub 1, a standard port standard property used in CloudHub. And the path we can just set to hello. We'll just log that a request has been received, and for the transform message, set in the response. We can just set our message as hello world. So this is our app essentially. Now obviously this isn't following best practices or has all of the sort of components you'd normally expect to see, like properties or thorough login or API kit, but for the purpose of this demo, this should be okay. So now I've created the app. The next step is to start looking at the pom.xml and configuring this. And the first thing I'll do is we can come to the CloudHub 2 Maven plugin documentation, and we can take this big section here and just copy and paste it across. So it's the Mule Maven plugin. You can see we've already got this plugin, so we'll want to overwrite it and use Command-Shift-F to reformat it and create nice indentation. Now what we'll need to do is start configuring this POM to make it suitable to be deployed into Runtime Manager and CloudHub 2. So the first thing is the group ID. This has to be the ID of the business group that we want to deploy into. So we can get that from either Access Management, we can click on the organization and use this organization ID here, or we can also get it from Exchange. So I've not currently got assets here. If I just create a dummy one, doesn't really matter for the details for now. But once this is published, essentially when we're in Exchange, we can also get this ID from here. So normally you'd already see assets in Exchange, but because this is a trial account, I didn't have any, so I just created a dummy one. So again, this is the same ID that we saw in the organization. So this will be our group ID. And if you wanted a different business group, you'd be able to get that by going into a different business group and finding an appropriate asset. So I'll set that as my group ID. The artifact ID is okay. The version, we can keep it a snapshot for now. Just keep in mind that this will determine what the lifecycle state is in Exchange, whether it's stable or in development. And this name we can also keep as it is. So I'm happy with ch2 deployment example. Now when it comes to the plugin itself, there's some changes that we're going to need to make to these settings, as these are just example settings provided. And these settings, we can find the complete details of them in this table here. So this table walks through all of the details and the different settings that we're able to set. But we'll just go through the ones that we need for now. And the first thing that I'm going to do is actually move some of these over to this property section. If we have them in this property section, then we'll be able to override them. We can set defaults and override them when we run our Maven commands, which we'll look at a bit later. So the first one we can set is environment. Now by default, we just want Maven to deploy to the development environment. And in fact, for me, this is called Sandbox. So if we come over to Runtime Manager, click it, we can see we've got Sandbox. And obviously this would refer to your environments. You might have dev, QA, SIT, etc. The next one is target. So the target is either going to be a shared space or private space. Again, I'm going to make this into a property. And I'll call it ch target and add that up here. And in my case, I'm going to be deploying into a shared space in the US East region. So we're going to use CloudHub US East 2 as the target. The next one is Mule version. Normally we're going to be on the latest Mule version, and in this case we are. So we can set this Mule version as 4.4.0. The next thing is our username and password. Now, in the example, they actually use this username and password, and these would be the credentials that you use to deploy into CloudHub. I think it's better to use the server option. So if we look at the table for authentication, you can see these options available. So we've got the username and password, server, authorization token, or connected apps. I think the server option is the best option, as the others require you to store credentials in the source code itself. So anyone with the access to the repository would then have access to credentials that could deploy to CloudHub. Whereas with the server option, we just make a reference to a server, which is then configured in the Maven settings.xml. So here I'm actually going to change this to use server. And let's pull that back. And in my case, in my settings.xml, my server is going to be called MC Deployer. And we'll take a look at the settings.xml file in a moment and how that's configured. Next up is the application name. So again, I'll add that as a property. And again, we can just call it ch2 deployment example. Normally you'd also add on the environment name, so we'll just call it dev for now. App name, and then we've got our replicas and our vcores. I'll reduce that to 0.1 vcores, and one replica is fine in this case. If we wanted high availability, then we could increase that to 2 or more. And again, this will be a reason where we should use properties really. So when Maven runs its deploy, we can dynamically change these values, and perhaps in higher environments we want to make the replicas 2 or more. So if we have these properties up here, we'll be able to control that. Lastly here in the standard settings, we've got the deployment settings. The only thing I'm going to change here is the last mile security to false. So this means that between the ingress and the application, it will just be HTTP and not HTTPS. We can also change this forward SSL session to false. And we need to remove this public URL, as we aren't going to pass this in. Okay, so that's the deployment settings. The next thing that's not in this example is how do we handle properties if we want to create properties in Runtime Manager to run the app. So for example, the mule.env to determine a properties file, or a mule.key to decrypt any secure properties. So again, if we look at this table and scroll down, we'll see here we've got 2 sections that we can add to the top level. So we can add the properties and then its key value, and we can also add secure properties and its, again, key value. So these secure properties are ones that will appear in CloudHub 2 in Runtime Manager as protected properties. So let's just copy and paste this. And we want that there. And our key can be mule.env, we'll use dev. And similarly, we want the secure properties. And the key this time will be mule.key. and secure properties password, just as an example. Now, the next thing is we need to also ensure that our distribution repository is set up in the pond.xml. So at the minute we can see we've got our Anypoint Exchange v3 configured here, but we don't have the distribution repository. And that's something that's mentioned right at the start. So we'll go ahead and add this. And again, I'm going to change this name so it matches Anypoint Exchange v3. And this organization ID, we can use project.group ID here. So that's going to reference back to this project.group ID. And again, this is linked to the business group of where we're deploying to. So one of the key things with CloudHub 2 we need to realize is that when we do a deployment, we first need to publish into Exchange, and then when we do the deployment, CloudHub's going to pull the asset from Exchange and do the deployment that way, even though we're still using Maven commands. So that's why we need to configure this distribution management, and we need to set Anypoint Exchange v3, as you can see with the Exchange Maven repository as the distribution management repository. So now this pom.xml looks okay to me. I'll just quickly show an example settings.xml, and we can see how that looks. And then here we can see we've got the server configured as Anypoint Exchange v3. I've also got Anypoint Exchange v2. This isn't really needed anymore with this project. I've got the MC deployer, which is the credentials we'll use to actually deploy. If we look back to the server MC deployer, and similarly this ID links back to these credentials. And then we've also got the Mule repository, which is linked to the repositories down here for pulling dependencies in. So in this case, I've not included my username and password, but these are credentials you'd be able to get from Mule support once you've got an Anypoint platform account. You'd raise a ticket and be able to get these. And also to mention in my case, these credentials are the same for both pulling from Exchange and deploying to CloudHub. I've kept these separate though. Sometimes you might have two separate connected apps, one for pulling from Exchange and one for doing the deployments. That's because not everyone should have access to do these deployments. In terms of the connected app itself, we can see that here in connected apps. So again, called it MC deployer and given it the following scopes. So basically scopes to access Exchange and scopes to access CloudHub and perform the deployment. So now at this point, if I bring up my terminal and go to the project we've just created, so it's called CH2 deployment example. First command I need to use is maven clean deploy. So this will publish the jar file into Exchange. Okay, so I've made a mistake somewhere in the pom.xml, which I'll take a look at now. Okay, so the issue was actually in my settings.xml file that I'm using. So we'll try that command again. Okay, so this looks better. So hopefully this will now build the application and publish it into Exchange. Okay, so that's now completed, and we can also go ahead and see this asset in Exchange. So here's the application we've just built and published. And now the last step is to run maven clean deploy -d mule deploy. And this should actually do the deployment we're after. Okay, so that started deploying, and if we go over to CloudHub, we can see here our new app has started to deploy. So CH2 deployment example dev. If we go onto that and look at properties, again, we can see those custom properties we added. So mule.env is here, we can see it's set to dev, and the mule.key is set as a protected value. The only other thing to keep in mind is we can also override some of these values, and perhaps we should have made these properties as well, but if we did want to override them, let me open a new terminal. If we did want to override them, we could use Maven clean deploy -d mule deploy and then -d and the name of the property. So perhaps we want to change the app name. So we could use my -d app name equals and then give it a totally different name. And this is how you'd control deployments into different environments. So similarly, we could also say environment -d environment equals and then SIT or production. And this is it really. So this command is what's doing the deployment, and this is what we'd use in our CICD tools like Azure DevOps in order to do the deployments. And there we have it. We can also see now that our deployment has completed via Maven.